All right, so you have the handout 2 texts. And you have the instructions for a task. This is a consciousness-raising task. Which text is a literary text, and what makes it literary, and the other non-literary? So I'd like you to read the 2 texts and discuss your findings, and then afterwards we'll talk about. All right. So now my question is, why? What makes this text literary? So the first text is a poem, and you can find it on that link. The second is from a textbook that was used, that I used to use in EFL in France, Headway Upper Intermediate from Oxford University Press. And this is a tape script of a conversation that was used, of course, for things like counterfactuals and conditionals and things like that. It was a gap fill exercise. This now will allow me to start talking about what my understanding of the literary is in this construct of the literary in the everyday. Because this notion, while it falls under the umbrella of a multiliteracy framework, was really sort of my quirky sense. It's a term that dates back to the Prague School in the 1930s. It refers to features of a text that in some sense stand out from their surroundings. The term itself is a metaphorical extension of the concept of foregrounding in the visual arts. So it came from painting and photography. But in literary theory, foregrounding suggests that in any text that there are some sounds, words, phrases, or clauses that may be so different from what surrounds them, or from some perceived norm in the language more generally, that they are set into relief by this difference and made more prominent as a result. So if we go back to that metaphor in the visual arts, we can see in this painting by Kandinsky that these are foregrounded elements. We think of foreground, middle ground, background as a sense of perspective, right? And the most foregrounded is this shape, even though there is another shape that's similar to it, but the color of white makes it stand out even more. And so we have a sense of, by this foregrounding, it creates a sense of relationships between spaces and potential forms, whether we want to invest some kind of a narrative with that is yet another question. But it creates a coherence, and we have a sense of context or of meaning that is a balanced composition. The question then becomes, what does foregrounding look like in language? Now you can of course play with graphological elements and make letters different colors and different sizes, but when we talk really about language, we see that foregrounding involves bending the norms and conventions that govern language in order to draw attention to intended meanings. And we do this in many ways. So it can be to heighten or soften meaning, to express new or unique meaning, to differentiate perspectives, to invoke aesthetic and affective responses, to develop themes, or to create coherence. More specifically, there are 2 forms, very broadly speaking, that foregrounding takes. One is parallelism or extra patterning. So that is the holding constant of some features, so that those are usually structural, while others, usually lexical, are varied. And then deviation. So deviation is about subverting rules, conventions, and expectations. And I'm going to give you an example, a very simple example. This is the first line of a poem. The first line of his poem, Dollar, I have known the inexorable sadness of pencils. So there is actually an example of parallelism here, or extra patterning. Does anyone see it or feel it? Think linguistically. So in fact, what we have here is that the extra patterning has to do with the phonemes, the n and the eh, right? So I have known the inexorable sadness of pencils. I have known the inexorable sadness of pencils, right? So you have this sound patterning. This is a poem, and often, sound is related to that. You can think of it as a deviation, but it's a deviation that comes with repetition of parallelism of, right? It is a deviation, but it's a, right, from a norm. But But when we talk about deviation in this sense, we see that pencils are personified. That's a deviation from normal standard, right? And also the use of inexorable stands out as unusual or strange in this context. So this comes under the umbrella of foregrounding. So foregrounding is about making language strange in some sense in order to create meaning, okay? So what I'm trying to help you with is understanding more concretely, right, these two forms. How do we start recognizing strangeness, foregrounding in language? So coming now to this notion of the literary in the everyday, and we're still focusing on trying to come to an understanding of what we mean by the literary. The literary, in this context of the literary in the everyday, refers to the range of playful, creative, and non-conventional ways of making meaning that language enables. So linguistic and stylistic theories provide a number of terms, technical terms and descriptions for foregrounding. But the thing is that a lot of foreign language teachers don't have background in those particular disciplines. And also the fact is that because foregrounding is so particular to a given context, it's impossible to formalize every instance of foregrounding. So the FLLITE approach strives to articulate a more intuitive approach. And the way that we conceptualize this is by developing FLLITE categories of literary play. Another handout that you have in your packet. These are what we call the FLLITE categories of the literary. And again, this is kind of a tool for helping you to start to think about the literary in language. And it's about playfulness, right? Before we take a look at this more specifically, this notion of play, the idea behind this is that all languages involve foregrounding. So we all know how to play with language, even if we're not conscious of what we're doing technically. So we all know what it feels like to play with meaning, to bend language rules and systems to meet our communicative needs. So be careful, this is not the same thing as breaking rules that generate errors, right? Language play is an essential function of, we talk about functions, right? Communicative functions. It's an essential function in how languages work. And there are productive patterns and techniques for foregrounding. And they are language and culture specific. So the idea here is that students need proficiency in both the literal and the literary in order to really fulfill that promise of communicative efficiency or proficiency. And so in order to scaffold working with the literary, we came up with these categories of play, right? So let's just take a quick look at those. So sound play. So this can involve rhymes or rhythm or alliteration or repetition. Visual play has to do with image subversion. An example could be photoshopping when you're putting different images together. You have word play that can be about creating new or blended words. Grammar play, which has to do with paradigm subversion and grammatical metaphors. I'll talk a little bit more about this point later. Genre play can be genre subversion of any kind, genre mixing, intertextuality. Narrative play is blending or contrasting storytelling modes. Pragmatic play, intentionally violating norms of address and violating our expectations of interaction given a particular context. Perspective play involves some kind of subversion of perspective. So this notion of subversion is another way of thinking about the literary. Symbolic play, allegory, metaphors, metonymies. And culture play, subversion of cultural practices and products. And this is, the term that ACTFL uses, right? Culture is about practices and products. And here we're saying, yes, but what happens what kind of meaning may be invested when we subvert, intentionally subvert? Again, this is intentional subversion on the part of the speaker or writer. It's not haphazard. It's about making meaning. In this construct, again, of the literary in the everyday, when we talk about the everyday, it relates to texts. And Carl already talked about text, so it can be written or oral or image or film or, and a text of any genre, but it needs to be anchored in the language and the experiences of everyday life, just as this poem that we saw, the dialogue about love, is anchored in everyday life. And these are the situations and contexts that are the mainstay of lower division foreign language learning. But this whole dimension of the literary doesn't exist. It's always about literal meaning, that reductionist notion of meaning. So if you did the pre-workshop task of looking at some of the example lessons, you've seen some examples of everyday texts. But just to give you a quick sense of it, it can involve everyday genres. So things like letters, postcards, internet postings, ads, political speech about the everyday does include literary texts, can include literary texts. Poetry is a wonderful form in that in such a short text usually, right? There's so much foregrounding of meaning and playing with meaning that it helps to bring out these dimensions of meaning making. It can come from novels, songs, movies, anything, right? Memoirs, essays. The literary recontextualizing the everyday. This is an interesting one. Literary references and artifacts that are found in, there's a term that's used more recently, which is called the linguistic landscape. So how is writing integrated into the concrete world around us in graffiti, signage, restaurant menus? It can also be personal genres like diaries, collages, journals, fan fiction, etc. So the everyday, the kinds of texts that you work with lower level students, but now we're a spin on those texts. So to sum up, in a way, the literary in the everyday, it includes all possible instances of the literary, so meaning foregrounded meanings, with regards to language, imagery that interacts with language, and cultural historical contexts in an everyday text. So there are three main goals in working with this approach. The first is reinforcing learning of literal or prototypical meanings and uses, the norms and conventions. Now that may seem counterintuitive because we're talking about all this other stuff, but here's the interesting point. The pleasure that we experience from linguistic deviation in everyday language depends upon our knowledge of the norms or conventions of ordinary usage. Deviation only becomes pleasurable and interesting, and then I added, and utilizable for language learners when we know what it deviates from. So you can't bend a rule if you don't know what the rule is. So actually, by studying the literary, it reinforces our understanding of what the norms and conventions are. The second goal is about expanding the communicative range or proficiency of students, especially at the lower levels, without increasing the quantitative load of grammar topics and vocabulary, using the same syllabus that you have. If you're finding texts that encode the literal and the literary, you're expanding the students' potential for making meaning when they read, creating meaning when they speak or write. And so you're going sort of in depth as opposed to this quantitative notion of, okay, we have to have more grammar, more, vocabulary. No, let's use what they have, but to greater effect. The third goal is getting students to become authentic users of a foreign language. So authentic meaning is tied to a particular context and the particular perspectives of the speakers in that context. This is Jim G's notion of situated meanings. So this includes the literary and the literal, right? You can't just eliminate this whole dimension of language and call that becoming proficient in a language, right? So we're talking about becoming authentic users. So students become authentic users when they can engage their particular insider-outsider perspective, so this notion of transcultural, translingual, to interpret and negotiate these dimensions of meaning. It also raises, and I'll come to this in a moment, it raises the question of what is an authentic text. This came up a little bit earlier, and who is an authentic speaker. So becoming a teacher of meaning, this is a term that Claire Kramsch put out. Her term, becoming a teacher of meaning, is something that after the MLA report of 2007, she really started to explore and promote this concept. But those of us who were interested in this sort of said to ourselves, well, what does that mean, right? How do you become a teacher of meaning? What is involved? So here, kind of in a nutshell, it's about, as teachers, noticing foregrounding in text by working with FLLITE categories, let's say, of literary play, intuiting meaning, based on your knowledge of the norms and on evidence in the surrounding language, right? Because foregrounding sets language apart from the backgrounded language, right? So it's the surrounding language that the literary dimensions stand out from. trying to confirm or strengthen your intuitions with research. So I'm trying to help people to become intuitively, so that you don't have to do yet another degree in either literary studies or stylistics or linguistics or whatever. I'm trying to get you with what the knowledge that you have, you can start building on communicative language teaching or on whatever form of language teaching it is that you do, if you work in this way and then create a FLLITE lesson that pedagogically scaffolds the literal and the literary. And that is the goal of this workshop, is helping you to create those kinds of lessons. So there is one catch also, though, is that because meaning is so situated in particular contexts, there isn't always a way to reduce it to a single connotation. And this has been a frustration point for so many language teachers and students, right, is dealing with those gray areas, that messiness of language. And we don't always have easy answers. So when I was an ESL teacher, you know, the catchphrase was, oh, that's idiomatic. And it became this enormous category of idiomatic language usage. And people would say, well, just you know, memorize that you know, sentence, or just, you know, it's okay, don't worry about it. It's just like that, right? The fact is that the FLLITE approach embraces unpredictability. Once you start thinking about the literary and the literal, you realize that, okay, we don't have to try to answer everything. We embrace the unpredictable. And in sort of two ways. So it's unpredictability about the nature of students' interpretations. So there isn't always a right and wrong answer. That's another thing. I taught in China, taught ESL in China, and it was so very difficult for me. This was 1989 and 1990. And the notion of there can only be one right answer was so important to them, so ingrained in their educational system, that even then, when I was working with, you know, more standard, you know, kind of communicative language teaching, I just didn't know quite how to respond to this. You know, I was introducing them to a lot of, you know, ways of working and having students respond in a variety of ways. And they'd say, well, no, we can't use that. We're only allowed one right answer per, you know, question or per activity. So you have to embrace the unpredictable nature of students' interpretations, which means that when it comes to assessment, you have to be more flexible, and we're going to look at assessment tomorrow. You have to be a little bit more flexible with how you're assessing your students. But also the unpredictable effects on students developing identities in relationship to a foreign language. We all bring to a foreign language our own identities. We're interacting with a new identity. It's that third position, right, or thirding that Claire Crumpsch talks about, which is that transcultural dimension. And we do all of this by helping students to develop level-specific languacultural skills and strategies. So I'm going to be breaking this down right over the course of this workshop. There are specific skills and strategies. There are specific techniques that we can use that can help us to become these teachers of meaning.